Hummingbird's Daughter and The Devil's Highway. Teach at University of Illinois at Chicago. Originally from Tijuana. Was born in Tijuana, raised in San Diego. My mom was American. She's from New York City. My dad was Mexican, originally from Rosario, Sinaloa. Spanish and English
How did that
exclusively.
How did that go?
That didn't go well. My father, like many immigrants, it was important to him to try to master English. And he had this policy that he would memorize 5 pages of the dictionary at a time. And then he would quiz himself with people. My mom never learned any Spanish at all. So they had a kind of a literary, linguistic, cultural war going on.
Okay.
My mother was winning the culture war because she, we were living in San Diego, so books in English were available, and she was quite literary and was always bringing in books, and they shared enthusiasms. They both loved Hemingway, for example. They both loved Steinbeck, though he was a little offended by, tortilla flats, stuff like that. They loved James Bond books, really liked Ian Fleming. So my mother was winning the literary war with me, and my dad wanted me to study more Spanish and Mexican literature. So he came from Tijuana one day with 2 paperback Spanish translations of the Iliad and the Odyssey, and he put it on the table and he said quite forcefully, "Study these in the original Spanish," which I thought was a great. Yeah, my dad smoked a lot, and he was quite expressive, and he had very stylized. He would always put his head back like that. But when we left the barrio, Southeast San Diego, Tijuana border area, and moved to a white suburb, working class suburb, we were the first Mexicans on the block, if not the entire neighborhood. And at that time, when I first got there, I still had my barrio accent, and so I didn't look Mexican, but I sure sounded Mexican. So I started hearing racial epithets for the first time. I'd never heard that stuff before. Stuff like pepper belly, taco bender, of course wetback, greaser. Greaser was quite vivid. And for some reason, greaser and wetback stuck in my mind. And I started thinking I had a grease spot on my clothing. And I thought, well, I have a back wet with grease, and I just can't find it. I can't see it, but they can see it. And it always looked in my mind like Italian salad dressing, kind of oily and awful. And I would look, I could not find the grease. And I couldn't figure out how they'd found it. And so I got home, and I told my dad, Dad, these guys are calling me wetback and greaser, and, I'm really ashamed. I don't know what to do. My dad, with his perpetual cigarette, he smoked Pall-Malls until he found out Benson and Hedges 100s had more tobacco. But he was smoking, and he took the cigarette out, and he tipped his head back. I like to tell people it was as though he had transformed into a college professor automatically and began a lecture. He said, "Mijo, in the western expansion across the United States, los gringos came in covered wagons. And the gringos were so stupid, they did not know how to keep their axles in good shape. And so the wagons broke down. And the only people who had the technology to grease the axles were Mexicans." He said, "So when they call you greaser, hold your head up because it's a sign of respect." The Kiriyama Prize, which is the Pacific Rim Award, I was a finalist last year for nonfiction for The Devil's Highway, and I just got word that I'm a finalist this year for fiction. And it turns out it's the first time in history that a writer's been nominated for the award in 2 different genres, which is really exciting. If I win, it'll be the first time in history that a Mexican or Mexican-American wins. Friends of mine used to joke with me that I practice writing fu. Not kung fu, but writing fu. And, that sort of became one of my favorite jokes, that I had a black belt in writing fu, partially because I think of my sort of cosmic and Zen-like approach to the writing process. But then I discovered, probably 10 years ago, that the first writing text on record is a book called Wen Fu. Wen Fu is Chinese for writing fu. And it had been written by a poet named Lu Chi. And it really was astounding to me because my childhood nickname, Luisito, in Spanish, reduces down to Luchi. So they used to call me Luchi. So when I saw that writing Fu by Luchi, I thought, wow, it's a sign from God. Yeah, writing in English. I guess it's somewhat like Joseph Conrad writing in English, not Polish, but English is the fabric of the culture in which I live. I didn't end up staying in Mexico. I came and lived here. So I've had all of my education in English. I do most of my reading in English. Certainly 75% of my communication with anybody at any time is in English. Most of the media we listen to and watch is in English unless I'm listening to Spanish music or reading Spanish poets. So I think partially it's a question of just access of computer language. It's a primary hookup, and I'm hooked into the Spanish program at present. If I go to Mexico for any extended period of time, my mind switches over. It's really odd. I mean, I was saying at the talk today that when I'm in Mexico for a while, I begin to dream in Spanish. And as soon as I dream in Spanish, it's like there's some kind of new program. It's switched to the other program, and it becomes much more facile and much more natural. So much so that if I'm there long enough, my Spanish accent from my boyhood comes back. Looking more Mexicano than when I left, and I start to sound like my father. Oh, they call me Güero, just Güero. In Sinaloa, they used to call me Pata de Cochi, which is pig foot, because I had these white feet. They'd never seen bright white feet before, They used to call me Pata de Cochi, because it looked like a pig foot to them. Yeah, the Urea family. The word Urea is a Basque name, and it stands for men of gold. So apparently the Urea color scheme has been the same down through history. If you look up some of the old editions of Don Quixote where the family is mentioned, in the footnotes I found, to my total fascination, that the Urea family traditional color of golden or red hair, blue or green eyes, has been traced back to the Visigoths when they invaded Spain. And interestingly enough, and certainly sort of tangentially, because there's nothing you could prove, but the Visigoth ruler that settled in the region we came from was known as Urayas, spelled very similar to Urea.
If you were speaking to a sort of international group who didn't know any Spanish, and you said, what one Spanish writer, would you say, here's the one you have to read, or what poet? How would you, here's the lines I want you to know?
Certainly in poetry, one of the which was overwhelming to me. But when I read his poem on poetry itself, and there's one little moment where he says, I don't know where poetry entered. And it just, I don't know why, that little moment just wiped me out, because it was true that he says, there's this world of marvels and wonders, and I don't know how it got me, but it came to me. I don't know where it entered. And it made writing a kind of a presence, an almost angelic presence, that came from without and inhabited him. And that was something that I started to feel too, that this thing, whatever it was, came from somewhere and chose me. I don't feel like I chose it.
That's great. You mentioned today that you just, when you're writing, you just have to catch these little gifts every day, and you were a gift to us today.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Well, I learned Spanish before I learned English, and then when I went to school, that's when I started speaking English. I took a Spanish minor, or took a lot of Spanish classes, and I didn't think they'd be at all useful for studying Milton or Shakespeare, the English Renaissance, but it's after moving here that slowly my research started moving towards comparative literature. I read in Spanish because my mother would have books lying around, and then I also would write to my uncles and aunts in Mexico, No, I did not have a sense of great literature. I'd heard of Don Quixote, so I picked it up on my own, but didn't like it the first 10 times reading it. And it was only the 11th time, after discussions with you and other people, where finally I started liking Don Quixote quite a lot. Well, I think it's Spanish literature has made itself peripheral because we had the Spanish Inquisition. We have Latin American countries being more busy trying to build bridges and roads than create great libraries. So there's been a lot of practical reasons for Spanish literature not being on the literary map. But I think with the rise of Spanish-speaking population, it's going to be really important. Growing up in California was very neat. We always celebrated in September Mexican Independence Day, and in May Cinco de Mayo, but it was seen just more as cultural in terms of dancing and celebrations, not in terms of literature. None of us were required to read Don Quixote in translation or Gabriela Garcia Lorca or anything like that.
Right.
Pablo Neruda. His most famous poem, The Heights of Machu Picchu. I'm only going to read the opening stanza. Okay, so the opening of Machu Picchu is: Del aire al aire como una red vacía, iba yo entre las calles y la atmósfera, llegando y despidiendo. En el advenimiento del otoño, la moneda extendida de las hojas. Y entre la primavera y las espigas, lo que el más grande amor, como dentro de un guante que cae, nos entrega como una larga luna. So it begins nice and lyric that way. But then it goes through some phases, and then the very last lines is, again, it's just culminating at the end, is: Dadme el silencio, el agua, la esperanza, dadme la lucha, el hierro, los volcanes, apegadme los cuerpos como imanes, acudid a mis venas y mi boca, hablad por mis palabras y mi sangre. So, I like that one better.
What's the poem about?
It's about his visit to ancient ruins of Machu Picchu, and that really being a symbol of his disconnect and his isolation, personal as well as actually literary. He was active in the early 20th century. Del aire al aire is from air to air. Como una red vacía is like an empty net. And Spanish speakers today know red because that's what they use for the web. Instead of the World Wide Web or the internet, they use red.
How do you spell it?
R-E-D. Del aire al aire como una red vacía.
And what's that mean?
From air to air, like an empty net. Iba yo entre las calles y la atmósfera, llegando y despidiendo. Going back and forth between the roads and the atmosphere. And then the third line is: En el advenimiento del otoño, la moneda extendida. Lavish at autumn's coronation with leaves, proffering money. It's 6 lines long, but he writes in irregular stanzas. The introductory stanza just happens to be 6 lines long. Y entre la primavera y las espigas, lo que el más grande amor, como dentro de un guante que cae. That's my favorite image in there. Like, como dentro de un guante que cae is as a glove that falls. And then what is like a glove that falls? El más grande amor, love, is like a glove that falls, which brings us to the large moon. This sort of surreal sort of idea of the moon as fingers, as hand, you know, this cupped sort of thing, which you don't get images like that. And I looked for them in 20th century Anglophone literature. It's just a different perception of what the moon could be. The end between is he feels a sense of isolation at these ruins. There's no horrible story about them. They just found these ruins, didn't know why the people disappeared. It's not like they have huge mass graves or, you know, signs of a huge fire or anything like that. It's just, you know, an archaeological find. And the racial element would actually be that his original name is not Pablo Neruda, which is just such a fabulous name. If you had to pick a name, I guess you'd name yourself Pablo Neruda.
Why?
Well, I love the sound of it. Pablo Neruda. Oh, here's his real name is Neftali Reyes, which to him sounded too impoverished. So he wanted.
Is that a Spanish name?
It's a Spanish Indian name, but Reyes means kings. But that name connotes having been colonized. So he changed it to Pablo Neruda. The end is Dadme el silencio, el agua, la esperanza, which means really strong. The dadme, it's give me silence, water, hope. And then the next line is Dadme la lucha, el hierro, los volcanes, give me the fight or the battle, iron and volcanoes. So again, these images are very specific. Apégadme los cuerpos como imanes, let bodies cling like magnets to my body. What does that mean? It doesn't matter to a certain extent, just as wonderful. Acudid a mis venas y a mi boca, come quickly to my veins and to my mouth, which I think is a really neat him as a poet, an image of him as a poet with his whole body and all the teeny little veins coming out through his mouth. And then finally, coming out through his mouth, the final line in it is hablad por mis palabras y mi sangre. And the key word here is por, which means for, but in Spanish there's an ambiguity. So this line could be either speak for my words and my blood, or speak by means of my words and my blood. Dadme el silencio, el agua, la esperanza, dadme la lucha, el hierro, los volcanes, apégadme los cuerpos como imanes, acudid a mis venas y mi boca, hablad por mis palabras y mi sangre.
That's great. Thanks a lot.
I love those lines.